Hello and welcome to my YouTube. This YouTube is remembering the year 1776. What do you know about the year 1776 in America? If I ask that question to most Americans, I'll get this kind of an answer. The Declaration of Independence was signed? And that's about all that the average American remembers. Period. The Declaration of Independence was signed on July 4th, 1776. Well, this YouTube is going to tell you a little more about what the year 1776 was really like. So I want to tell you what else happened in 1776. And I'm your host, Dr. Maury Reese. The American Revolutionary War had started on April 19, 1775, with the Battle of Lexington and Concord. Let me take 2 minutes and review what led up to the start of the American Revolutionary War. I'll keep it simple. The 7 Years' War between Britain and France had ended in 1763, but it had cost the British a lot of money, and they needed to raise a lot of money. For one thing, they had this big army stationed in the colonies, and that cost a lot of money. So their parliament said, well, we need to raise money, so why don't we raise some of that money from those colonists over there? So the British Parliament decided to raise revenues by taxing the colonies. Parliament passed the Stamp Act, which required that most printed materials in the colonies be produced on stamped paper from London, which included an embossed revenue stamp. Printed materials included legal documents, magazines, playing cards, newspapers, and many other types of paper used throughout the colonies. And it had to be paid in British currency, not in colonial paper money. So this is the first thing they did to raise money. Parliament passed the Commissioners of Customs Act. This created a new customs board for the North American colonies to be headquartered in Boston. New offices were eventually opened in other ports as well. The board was created to enforce shipping regulations and increase tariff revenues. So this is the second thing they did. Parliament passed the Townshend Act in 1767 that placed new taxes on paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea that were imported into the colonies. These were items that were not produced in North America and that the colonists were only allowed to buy from Great Britain. Parliament passed the Tea Act in 1773, which granted the East India Company a total monopoly on the importation and sale of tea in the colonies. And of course, this led to the famous Boston Tea Party in 1773. Tea was probably the most important drink in the colonies and the British Empire. Parliament passed the Boston Port Act and closed the Port of Boston. There were only 3 major ports in America: New York, Boston, and Charlotte. And they closed the Port of Boston. Parliament passed the Massachusetts Government Act, which restricted Massachusetts Democratic town meetings and turned the Governor's Council into an appointed body appointed by the king. Parliament passed the Administration of Justice Act, which made British officials immune to criminal prosecution in Massachusetts. So, one of those officials could go out and kill somebody or rob a bank, and there was nothing you could do about it. He was immune. Parliament passed the Quartering Act, which required colonists to house, feed, and quarter British troops on demand in their private homes. So you could be sitting there at supper and suddenly there's a knock on your door and here are 4 or 5 soldiers, and you had to bring those soldiers into your home, provide them beds, and feed them at no cost to the British government. The New York Restraining Act of 1767 forbade the New York Assembly and the governor of New York from passing any new laws until they complied with the Quartering Act. In other words, if you didn't house and feed our soldiers, you couldn't pass any laws. Parliament passed the Indemnity Act of 1767, which reduced taxes on the British East India Company. This allowed them to export tea to the colonies more cheaply and to sell it to the colonists for greater profit. The Vice Admiralty Court Act gave British Admiralty courts, rather than colonial courts, jurisdiction over all matters concerning customs violations and smuggling. And so, how many members of the British Parliament were represented by the 13 colonies? You and I, we have representatives in the House of Representatives that represent us. How many members of the British Parliament were from the colonies? And the answer, none. Not a single person represented the colonies in the British Parliament who had just passed all of these new taxes and regulations. And so the battle cry across the 13 colonies became no taxation without representation. And here we have the seeds of the American Revolution. So, what happened in 1776 in these 13 British colonies? A little reminder, these are the 13 colonies, all the way from Georgia all the way up to New Hampshire. Notice that Vermont and Maine are missing. They were not part of the 13 colonies. Vermont became a state in 1790, and Maine was not admitted until 1830. It's important to understand that about 25% of the colonists remained loyal to the British king. And in my presentations, I'll refer to them as loyalists. So anytime you see or hear the word loyalist, these are people that are loyal to the British king. So can you imagine 1 out of 4 Americans were not in favor of the Revolutionary War. On January 1st, the town of Norfolk, Virginia is destroyed and burned by the combined actions of the British Royal Navy and occupying loyalist forces. In other words, people living in the town that were loyal to the king helped the British Navy burn down the town. Can you imagine? On February 27th, the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge, Scottish North Carolina loyalists charge across Moores Creek Bridge near Wilmington to attack what they mistakenly believed to be a small force of rebels, or patriots. The Patriots' victory virtually ends all British authority in North Carolina. So these loyalists charge across to attack these patriots, and the patriots wiped them out, and that was the end of British authority in North Carolina. On March 2nd, the Battle of Nassau. This is interesting. We always think of the American Revolution as just something that was fought here in the 13 colonies. But here's the Bahamas. The Bahamas is an island 200 miles off the coast of Florida. And the American Continental Navy and Marines make a successful assault on Nassau, Bahamas, which of course was British. On March 4th, American patriots captured Dorchester Heights, dominating and controlling the port of Boston. Now remember, the British had closed the port, but these patriots attacked and took control of it. Finally, on March 17th, threatened by Patriot cannons on Dorchester Heights, the British evacuate Boston, ending the 11th month siege of Boston. On the 25th, American patriots conduct a raid on Tybee Island in Georgia, primarily seeking to capture runaway slaves who sought refuge with British forces stationed there on that island. On April 12th, the Royal Colony of North Carolina passes the Halifax Resolution, making it the first British colony to officially authorize its Continental Congress delegates to vote for independence from the Kingdom of Great Britain. On May 4th, Rhode Island becomes the first American colony to officially renounce allegiance to King George III of Great Britain. Now, this is 2 months before the Declaration of Independence, so each of these colonies was acting independent on their own. And here Rhode Island says, that's it, we're declaring our independence from King George. On June 7th, Richard Henry Lee of Virginia proposes to the Second Continental Congress, which was meeting in Philadelphia, that, and I quote, "These united colonies are, and of right ought to be, free and independent states." So this is the beginning of the movement for independence, this speech by Richard Henry Lee from Virginia. The idea that they ought to be free. On June 11th, the Continental Congress appoints a committee of 5 to draft. Notice they didn't use the word write. They would to draft a Declaration of Independence. By writing a draft, that meant that the Continental Congress was free to modify and argue and debate about the actual wordings. And who did they choose? Thomas Jefferson, John Adams, Benjamin Franklin, Roger Sherman, and Robert L. Livingston. And this is a picture of the 5 men who basically wrote the Declaration of Independence. And let me show you the bigger picture. This is the one you're familiar with. The signing of the Declaration of Independence. And here they are. These are the 5 men, and that's why they're standing up here. They wrote the draft of the Declaration of Independence. And they did argue about it for several days, nitpicking the exact words. It was a big fight, actually, in the Continental Congress. On June 15th, Delaware Separation Day. The Delaware General Assembly votes to declare independence from the British Crown. And this is a month before the Declaration of Independence. So here we have a second colony that's saying, we're free on our own. We declare ourselves free of Britain. On June 28th, the Battle of Sullivan's Island in South Carolina. the militia repel a British attack on Charleston. This was very important because Charleston was the most important city and the biggest port in the South. On June 29th, the Battle of Turtle Gut Inlet, the American Continental Navy successfully challenges the British Royal Navy blockade of New Jersey. And I find this amazing. I mean, the British Navy was one of the greatest, most powerful navy on the face of the earth. And here this little ragtag Continental Navy was able to beat their blockade. Amazing. On July 2nd, the Second Continental Congress passes the Lee Resolution, which asserts that the United Colonies have separated from Great Britain and are now a separate country. This resolution was brought forward by Richard Henry Lee on instructions from his home state of Virginia. July 2nd, they bring forward this resolution. We ought to be free. On July 4th, the United States Declaration of Independence, in which the United States officially declares independence from the British Empire. It is approved by the Continental Congress and signed by its president, John Hancock, and 55 other members of the Continental Congress. And this is what it looks like. And John Hancock is famous for his signature. Big and bold. He says, I'm gonna make it big and bold so fat King George doesn't have to put on his glasses to read it. And this has come down through history when we talk about sign your John Hancock, we mean sign your signature. And here it is, big and bold. Can't miss that. 4 days later, on July 8th, the Liberty Bell rings for the first public reading of the Declaration of Independence at the Pennsylvania State House in Philadelphia. So it didn't ring on July 4th, it rang on July 8th. So this is the first time that the general public heard the Declaration of Independence. It was read out loud on July 8th, and the bell was rung. So where's that famous crack? The bell cracked in 1835. And the crack got bigger in 1846, and the bell has not been rung since then. That's the last time it rang, 1846. On July 9th, an angry mob in New York City topples the equestrian statue of George III in Bowling Green Park, which is in Manhattan. On August 2nd, a parchment copy of the Declaration of Independence is signed by 56 members of Congress who had not been present on July 4th. On August 15th, the first Hessian troops, and I'll talk about them in a moment, land on Staten Island to join British forces. The Hessians. On August 27th, the Battle of Long Island. George Washington's troops are defeated and routed in Brooklyn by the British under General William Howe. This is fascinating. On September 7th, the world's first submarine attack. An American submersible craft called the Turtle attempts to attach a time bomb to the hull of the British Admiral Richard Howe's flagship HMS Eagle in New York Harbor. So it's basically a barrel, and he has a little window here so he can see where he's going. And he has a hand crank that turns this little propeller, and this is how he moves through the water. And this arm turns a paddle here on the back, and that's how he steers. So what he wanted to do was sneak up in the middle of the night and attach a bomb to the hull of this ship. It didn't work. He tried to attack 5 different ships before this thing was eventually, it was always carried around by a support ship. And that support ship was attacked and sunk by the British Navy. And when it sank, it also sank the Turtle, and it was never recovered. But that's the first submarine in warfare in the Revolutionary War. On September 11th, the British and Americans meet at Staten Island Peace Conference seeking to end the revolution. The meeting is brief and unsuccessful. The war continues for another 7 years. On September 15th, the British land on Manhattan at Kipps Bay. On August 15th, the Allies, the Continental Congress has authorized an army. So the 7th Marine Regiment is authorized. The 4th New Jersey Regiment is raised. The 7th North Carolina Regiment is raised. And the 11th Pennsylvania Regiment. So all of these colonies get busy, and they each raise an army to support the Continental Army. On September 20th, the Great Fire of New York City begins, and it burns much of New York. While there was no confirmed source of the fire, several theories have been speculated, the most common stating that American rebels deliberately started it in response to British occupation. The day that the Redcoats took over the city, they discovered combustible items and had to clear a trail of gunpowder that led away from it. Now, the Americans claim that the British burned New York City. On September 22nd, Nathan Hale is executed in New York City by the British for espionage. Nathan Hale was an officer in the Continental Army. And George Washington needed to know what the British were up to. So Nathan Hale volunteered to go behind enemy lines to try to determine how the British were going to attack New York City. Unfortunately, some of the British officers recognized him, and he was arrested. He was tried for spying and hanged. And history remembers him for these words: "I regret that I have but one life to give for my country." On October 11th, the Battle of Valcour Island on Lake Champlain near Valcour Island, a British fleet defeats 15 American gunboats commanded by Brigadier General Benedict Arnold, shown here. Although nearly all of Arnold's ships are destroyed, the 2-day long battle will give Patriot forces enough time to prepare defenses of New York City. Of course, Benedict Arnold became a traitor. He joined the British Army eventually. Now, I always found this battle fascinating. A sea battle. Well, not exactly a sea. Lake Champlain. If you don't know where that is, let me show you. Here's a map of New York. Down here is New York City. Here's Buffalo. Here's Albany. And way up here at the very top, this is Lake Champlain. Uh, it's about 100 miles long and it's only about 10 miles wide. I know this lake very well because I went to a Navy nuclear power training right here in Saratoga Springs, New York, right here. So I've been to this lake a lot. So it always amazed me that there was a naval battle on this lake in the middle of nowhere in upstate New York. But there you have it. On October 18th, the Battle of Pell's Point in the Bronx, and the colonial army was defeated by the British. They kept driving them back and back and back. On October 31st, in his first speech before British Parliament since the Declaration of Independence that summer, King George III acknowledges that all is not going well for the British in the war with the colonies. On November 16th, the Battle of Fort Washington. Hessian forces capture Fort Washington, which is in Manhattan, from the American Continental Army. This was a huge defeat. On November 20th, the Battle of Fort Lee, which was the invasion of New Jersey by British and Hessian soldiers and forced a general retreat of the Continental Army. So things were not going well for the Continental Army in November of 1776. It was one defeat after the other. This is interesting. On December 7th, the Marquis de Lafayette attempts to join the American military as a major general at the age of 19, but he is not given command of any American forces. He comes back 4 years later and is given command of an American army and was considered a hero of the Revolutionary War. But he was made a general at the age of 13 in France. Go figure. On December 19th, Thomas Paine, living with Washington's troop, publishes the first in a series of pamphlets on the American crisis in the Pennsylvania Journal, opening with these stirring phrases, quote, "These are the times that try men's souls." On Christmas Day at 6 o'clock in the evening, General George Washington and his troops, numbering about 2,400 soldiers, crossed the Delaware River and in the dark and land on the New Jersey banks by 3 o'clock the following morning. And of course, this is one of the most famous paintings in American history. Washington crossing the Delaware. You know what? That painting was destroyed. That painting was destroyed in 1942 because it was hanging in a museum in Dresden, Germany, and the British bombed that museum and destroyed this painting. Fortunately for history, the artist made 2 copies which have survived. And so the next morning, on December 26th, the Battle of Trenton, Washington's troops surprised the 1,500 Hessian troops at 8 o'clock in the morning outside Trenton and score a victory, taking 948 prisoners while suffering only 5 wounded. A huge victory for the army. So that's what happened historically during the year 1776. Let's talk about what was life like in 1776 in these 13 colonies. Well, the combined colonial economy was only about 30% the size of Great Britain. However, the standard of living in the colonies was considerably higher than in England because of a smaller population. And the members of parliament knew this. They knew that things were really pretty good in the colonies. So that's why they were anxious to begin to tax those guys. Families were larger, averaging 5.8 people compared to only 3.1 today. During the Revolutionary War, about 50,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or died. This adds up to about 1% of the total population. In comparison, for World War II, it was 0.39%. Boys could join the Continental Army at the age of 16 as soldiers, and even younger as fife, drum, or bugle players. Boys as young as 7 years old joined the Army as drummers or messenger carriers. For you women, can you imagine letting your little 7-year-old son march off to war? And I'm talking about on the front lines where the shooting was happening. That's where the drummer boys were. Most people only had 2 or 3 pairs of clothing, and they only bathed a few times a year. I don't know what to say about that. Medicine was very primitive during these times. Doctors still believed that cutting people to let their bad blood out would help them get better. Bleeding. People were always working, even the kids. It was considered a sin to be lazy. Some common jobs or trades during the American Revolution including blacksmith, farmer, shoemaker, tailor, cooper, these are guys that make barrels, wheelwrights, these are guys that make wagon wheels, milliners, and printers. Unlike modern-day newspapers, most papers published on a weekly basis. The process of making a newspaper was time-consuming, and on average, it would take up to 25 hours to typeset a 4-page issue. During the Revolutionary War, many newspapers increased their circulation from 400 copies to an average of 2,500 copies per issue. This was the way the citizens got the news about what was going on during the war. The total population was 3.9 million people, and of those, 700,000 were slaves. The largest city was Philadelphia with 60,000 people. New York City had a population of 25,000, and Boston was the third largest city with a population of 15,000. So Philadelphia was bigger than New York City and Boston combined. In 1776, 95% of all Americans were farmers. We tend to think of the colonial people in their little villages and their towns, but 9 out of 10, more than 9 out of 10, lived out in the country on the farm, not in towns and cities. In 1776, the average daily wage for unskilled labor in America was generally around $1. This included both farm labor and other types of work in cities, a whole $1 a day. The British Army in the colonies had 22,000 professional soldiers and 25,000 colonists that were loyal to the king, and they also hired 30,000 Hessians. Hessians, I should say. The Hessians were hired professional German mercenaries. So the British didn't have enough troops. They went to Germany and hired these guys. And these Hessians were hated, really hated by the American colonists. In fact, the Declaration of Independence mentions Hessian soldiers, even though it doesn't explicitly name them. The Declaration condemns the king for, quote, transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries. While the document doesn't specifically mention Hessians by name, it's widely understood that the foreign mercenaries referred to were the Hessian soldiers hired by the British. Life expectancy in 1776 was only 35 years. Today it's 77. So you can imagine, if you were 30 years old, you were an old man. You only had 5 years on average to live. A good horseman could travel up to about 40 miles in a day. It would take a man 5 days to travel from Boston to New York City. Women were expected to be married by age 20. So if you were, say, 25 years old and unmarried, you were an old spinster. In 1776, girls received their education through dame schools, which were run by women in private homes. These dame schools focused on basic skills like reading, writing, as well as household skills like sewing and cooking. And for most girls, this was it. There was no more education. Why did they need it? They were just going to get married and raise children. That was their job in life. In 1776, there were 9 colleges operating in what would become the United States: Harvard, William and Mary, Yale, Princeton, King's, which later became Columbia, University of Pennsylvania, Brown, Dartmouth, and Queen's, which later would become Rutgers. 9 universities. In 1776, Harvard had 3 professors, Yale had 5 professors, and William and Mary had 6 professors. What were the favorite sports in 1776? There were 3 of them, depending on what part of the colonies you lived in. Horse racing, which of course they inherited from Britain. Cockfighting, which was most popular in the southern colonies. And there was boxing, but the colonists had something called rough and tumbling. Let me tell you about that. Rough and tumbling. One of the most useful things, and one of the things that they tried to do, was gouging out the eyes of your opponent. Yeah. And it was considered very embarrassing to let your eyes be gouged out. And they also used their teeth. Some of these men actually sharpened their teeth, and they would bite off the ear or bite off the nose of their opponent. But the favorite technique was gouge out the eyes of your opponent. Rough and tumble. Multitasking in 1776. And most of us think of multitasking as a recent trend, but Thomas Jefferson had a need to consume information from multiple sources at, quote, breakneck speed. As many as 5 books could be placed on this bookstand, which was made according to Jefferson's design, and then he could spin it around. Thomas Jefferson is always one of the men in history that I admired the most. He was everything. He was a politician, he was a musician, he was an inventor, he was a farmer, he was a statesman. He did it all. And he designed a lot of things too. It would take about 7 weeks to sail from England to America in 1776. Thomas Jefferson's cook, James Hemings, brought macaroni and cheese to America. Thomas Jefferson was the ambassador to France, and this chef went with him and came back and brought macaroni and cheese to the American cuisine. In 1776, colonial Americans drank 3 times as much alcohol as modern Americans, primarily in the form of beer, cider, and whiskey. And why did they drink so much alcohol? They didn't trust the water. So thanks for watching. I hope you learned something you didn't know about 1776. Be well.